On January 23, 2025, the global financial order shifted in a single stroke of a pen. President Donald J. Trump signed an executive order establishing the world's first strategic Bitcoin reserve, a move the media celebrated as pro-innovation, pro-crypto, and pro-technology. Bitcoin surged to $100,000 within hours. Commentators called it a renaissance of American leadership in digital finance. But behind the headlines, behind the market euphoria, something far more consequential was unfolding. This was not a cryptocurrency policy. It was a declaration of economic war. For the first time since 1971, the United States openly signaled its intention to weaponize a monetary asset, not the dollar, not gold, but Bitcoin, a neutral asset, borderless, stateless, and immune to central bank manipulation. By placing Bitcoin inside America's strategic reserve framework, the executive order transformed Bitcoin into a geopolitical instrument, not a commodity, not a speculative asset, a weapon. And one country recognized the threat faster than anyone else, China. Within 72 hours, the Chinese Communist Party convened an emergency session of the Politburo Standing Committee, the highest governing body in China, 7 men who control 1.4 billion people and direct the world's second largest economy. They did not meet to discuss Taiwan, the South China Sea, semiconductors, or trade. They met for one reason only: Bitcoin. Because in Beijing's eyes, Trump's executive order was not domestic regulation. It was a direct strike at China's monetary ambitions, a move designed to deny China an escape route from dollar dominance and prevent Beijing from using Bitcoin as a neutral bridge currency. To the Chinese leadership, the executive order was not innovation, it was encirclement. For decades, China has sought to weaken the dollar's global grip. They built swap lines, expanded the digital, yuan-hoarded gold, and cultivated BRICS. Yet none of these strategies could displace the dollar. Bitcoin, however, represented a new possibility, a path to bypass American financial power without demanding global trust in Chinese institutions. Trump's executive order slammed that door shut, and in that moment, the world entered the opening phase of a new monetary conflict, a currency war fought not with interest rates or sanctions, but with hash rate reserves and digital assets. A war that will define the balance of global power for decades. To understand why Trump's executive order triggered an emergency reaction inside Beijing, you must first understand what Bitcoin truly represents, not as an investment, not as a speculative instrument, but as a monetary superpower, the first in modern history that exists entirely outside the control of nations. For 75 years, the United States has dominated global finance through the dollar. The dollar is the world's reserve currency. It is the denominator of global trade, the backbone of commodity markets, the benchmark for sovereign debt. Nearly 70% of world trade settles in dollars. Over 60% of global central bank reserves are held in U.S. dollars or dollar-denominated assets. This system gives Washington immense strategic power. When America dislikes a nation's actions, it can weaponize access to the dollar. It can freeze reserves, block transactions, and cut entire countries out of SWIFT. It has done so repeatedly to Russia, Iran, Venezuela, Afghanistan, and dozens more. Every time the message is clear control of the dollar equals global influence. But this dominance comes with consequences. The more America uses the dollar as a weapon, the more the world seeks an alternative. For decades, China attempted to build such an alternative. They tried to internationalize the yuan, establish currency swap lines, create alternative payment systems, and structure commodity deals outside the dollar. Yet none succeeded. Why? Because the yuan is not trusted. It is managed by a one-party state. Its value is politically engineered. Capital controls restrict convertibility. Investors know Beijing can and does intervene whenever it wishes. A currency controlled by a single party cannot become the world's reserve asset. Enter Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the first monetary asset in human history that no government controls, no central bank can print, and no military can seize if properly secured. It is not American. It is not Chinese. It is not Russian. It is not European. It is neutral mathematically, structurally, and politically. Its supply is fixed. Its rules cannot be manipulated. Its ledger cannot be altered. This neutrality is precisely what terrifies governments. To nations threatened by U.S. sanctions, Bitcoin represents an escape hatch. To countries seeking monetary sovereignty, Bitcoin offers a path free from Western control. To populations living under capital restrictions, it is a lifeline. And to rising powers like China, Bitcoin offers what the yuan could not, a reserve asset the world might actually trust. For years, this made Bitcoin strategically useful to China. Beijing could envision a world where global trade settles in a neutral asset escaping the dollar without forcing partners to adopt the yuan. But that strategic vision collapses if the United States accumulates Bitcoin first. If America becomes the dominant sovereign holder of Bitcoin, then Bitcoin loses its neutrality. It becomes, in effect, an American-controlled monetary rail, an extension of U.S. power, not a counterweight to it. This is the existential danger China sees. When Trump signed the executive order establishing a strategic Bitcoin reserve, he signaled the beginning of a global competition for control of the only asset capable of rivaling the dollar's influence. A competition China cannot afford to lose. To most Americans, Trump's executive order looked like an economic experiment, a bold attempt to modernize U.S. reserves and embrace digital innovation. But to China, it was a direct strategic threat, one with implications as serious as tariff sanctions or military encirclement. Beijing understood immediately that this was not technology policy. It was monetary warfare executed through a digital asset that China had once hoped would undermine American dominance. Why the alarm? Because the order revealed a critical detail. The United States intends to accumulate 1 million Bitcoin. 1 million Bitcoin is not a symbolic number. It is the amount required for the U.S. Treasury to control a meaningful share of the global supply, nearly 5% of all Bitcoin that will ever exist. If America reaches that threshold before China or BRICS nations mobilize, Bitcoin's neutrality disappears. It becomes a de facto extension of U.S. monetary power, much like the dollar and Treasury bonds today. Beijing knows this because they once had the advantage. Between 2015 and early 2021, China controlled up to 75% of global Bitcoin mining hash rate. They could have accumulated hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin quietly. Instead, they cracked down. They miscalculated. They believed Bitcoin was a threat to capital controls, not a tool of geopolitical power. Trump's executive order revealed that the United States sees what China overlooked. Bitcoin is the first monetary asset capable of challenging dollar hegemony, and therefore the first asset China could use to erode it. By declaring Bitcoin a strategic reserve, Washington effectively preempted China's long-term strategy. Beijing suddenly found itself cornered. If America dominates Bitcoin, then China loses the only neutral pathway to challenge the dollar-based order. Worse, Bitcoin could become an American hard asset, weaponized the same way Washington weaponized the dollar. This is why the Politburo Standing Committee convened an emergency meeting within 72 hours. They recognized the order for what it truly was, a preemptive strike, a move designed to 1. Block China from using Bitcoin to escape U.S. financial dominance, 2. Secure early control of the only asset immune to sanctions, 3. Force the world into a U.S.-centric Bitcoin standard, 4. Neutralize China's decade-long plan to internationalize the yuan. For Beijing, this was intolerable. If China allowed the United States to monopolize sovereign Bitcoin holdings, it would mean accepting permanent dollar supremacy dressed in digital clothing. The Communist Party concluded that they had no choice. They would have to respond, not symbolically, not diplomatically, but strategically and aggressively. Trump's executive order was the first shot. China is preparing the second. China's response to Trump's executive order is not rhetorical, symbolic, or experimental. It is structural, systemic, and national in scale. Beijing is mobilizing across 4 synchronized fronts: mining, strategic purchasing, digital currency redesign, Valien, Min Jiachin, Tri Tao Than, Mo Chien Luok Dong Hop, Nhem Jam Bao Rang Bitcoin Kong Tro, Thanjak, Quien Du Tru Qua Hoa Kai. 1. The mining offensive hash power as national power. When China banned Bitcoin mining in 2021, the world assumed Beijing surrendered its influence. That assumption was wrong. The public mining industry left China, but state-controlled mining never stopped. It simply moved underground literally and politically. Units within the PLA Strategic Support Force continued mining through secure facilities in Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, and Sichuan, routing hash power through foreign pools to mask location. These operations, small at first, expanded dramatically after Trump's executive order. Within weeks, state-owned power companies received internal directives authorizing strategic computational projects, a euphemism widely understood by provincial authorities. China is now deploying industrial-scale mining farms with subsidized electricity, direct governmental protection, optimized cooling and hydro infrastructure, no regulatory barriers. Their target is explicit control, 20-30% of global hash rate by 2026. At that level, China would mine roughly 140 BTC per day, over 50,000 per year. In 3 years, that becomes 150,000 additional sovereign Bitcoin. This is the counterbalance to the United States' reserve accumulation. Hash rate is China's artillery. 2. Strategic OTC acquisition. The quiet buying program. China holds the world's largest foreign exchange reserves, $3.2 trillion. Converting even a fraction of that into Bitcoin would disrupt markets, so China is buying through offshore OTC desks in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Switzerland. State-linked asset managers, sovereign wealth fund, subsidiaries, and energy conglomerates are purchasing Bitcoin through structured deals invisible to public markets. Intelligence sources suggest $50,000, $80,000 BTC already quietly acquired, a $30 billion authorization for further purchases, a multi-year target of 250,000, 300,000 BTC, combined with mining China, aims to reach 500,000 sovereign Bitcoin. By 2028, half of America's 1 million target, enough to prevent U.S. monetary dominance. 3. The Bitcoin-backed digital yuan, a monetary weapon. China's digital yuan was once a surveillance tool. Now it is becoming a geopolitical weapon. The People's Bank of China has begun partially backing the ECNY with Bitcoin reserves. This changes everything. A Bitcoin-backed yuan becomes harder money than the US dollar, more attractive to sanctioned nations, an instant settlement currency without SWIFT countries that distrust China might still trust Bitcoin backing. This is how Beijing expands currency influence without asking the world to trust the Communist Party. It is monetary strategy through technological jujitsu. 4. BRICS coordination, a parallel monetary system. BRICS already represents 45% of the world's population and a third of its GDP. Now, under China's leadership, it is forming a BRICS Bitcoin reserve, a collective strategic pool targeting 500,000 to 1,000,000 Bitcoin. This reserve backs BRICS settlement units used for trade among member nations. A soybean sale from Brazil to India no longer needs dollars. A gas shipment from Russia to China settles in BRICS units backed by Bitcoin. This is the first serious challenge to the dollar since Bretton Woods. China's counteroffensive is not a reaction. It is a blueprint designed to prevent American Bitcoin monopoly and to build a multipolar financial order where Beijing is never again vulnerable to U.S. sanctions or dollar dominance. The global financial system has never witnessed two superpowers racing to accumulate the same scarce non-sovereign asset. In the 20th century, nations competed for oil manufacturing and gold. In the 21st century, the United States and China are competing for Bitcoin, an asset neither can control, but both believe they must possess to dominate the future monetary order. This is not a market cycle. This is state-driven accumulation, and once it begins, it does not stop. 1. The U.S. strategy, a monetary gambit. Trump's executive order is not a domestic economic policy, it is a geopolitical move. By declaring Bitcoin a strategic reserve, the United States effectively signaled, say, it intends to control Bitcoin liquidity, it intends to shape future global settlement standards. It intends to preempt any alternative reserve system. It intends to weaponize Bitcoin alongside the dollar. Treasury analysts know that if the U.S. becomes the first nation to accumulate 1 million Bitcoin, it sets the rules. Bitcoin becomes a dollar-aligned asset, not a neutral global reserve. This is why the executive order triggered China's emergency meeting. From Beijing's perspective, America was attempting a digital Bretton Woods locking in global monetary dominance for another century. And China understands what happens when the U.S. controls the reserve asset. They live through it. 2. China's strategic response breaking the monopoly. Beijing recognizes a simple truth. If Bitcoin becomes the global settlement asset, the first mover wins. China is determined not to let the United States dictate the rules again. Their response is threefold. A. Prevent American monopoly. China doesn't need more Bitcoin than the U.S. It only needs enough Bitcoin to ensure no single nation can dominate. B. Build a multilateral alternative. The BRICS Bitcoin reserve allows China to lead without appearing hegemonic. It turns Bitcoin into a shared strategic asset, one tied to the interests of half the world. C. Position the digital yuan for global use. A partially Bitcoin-backed currency instantly becomes credible to nations tired of U.S. sanctions and dollar dependency. Through this three-step approach, China transforms itself from a reactive power into an architect of the new financial order. 3. What a Bitcoin-driven monetary system looks like. The consequences of the U.S.-China Bitcoin race are profound. A. Reserve competition drives price exponentially. Nation-states do not DCA. They buy in chunks thousands of Bitcoin at a time. As both sides accumulate, Bitcoin becomes illiquid. Market supply collapses. Prices rise parabolically. A $1 million Bitcoin is not a fantasy. It is the logical end state of nation-state accumulation. B. A two-tier global system emerges. Western bloc dollar-centric U.S. regulated tied to Treasury Bitcoin reserves. Eastern BRICS bloc digital UN, and BRICS settlement, units backed by collective Bitcoin holdings. Bitcoin becomes the neutral bridge asset, a role gold once held before Nixon closed the gold window. C. Sanctions lose power. You cannot freeze Bitcoin the way you freeze dollar reserves. You cannot block Bitcoin the way you block SWIFT. In this new paradigm, sanction power is reduced, and with it, U.S. geopolitical leverage. 4. Why this war is inevitable. The currency war is not optional. It is not ideological. It is mathematical. U.S. debt is unpayable without asset revaluation. China needs an escape from dollar dominance. BRICS wants sovereignty. Bitcoin offers the only neutral settlement standard. The arithmetic of geopolitics is pushing every nation toward Bitcoin, and once two superpowers are locked in a monetary arms race, the outcome is no longer driven by markets. It is driven by state necessity. By 2027, the currency war stops being theory prediction or quiet accumulation. It becomes visible. It becomes undeniable. It becomes the global financial breaking point. For 2 years, the United States and China have raced to secure Bitcoin reserves, one openly through executive authority, the other covertly through state-controlled mining and offshore acquisition. But by mid-2027, both nations reach a threshold where every additional Bitcoin purchased creates disproportionate geopolitical consequences. And then the trigger comes. 1. The debt event. In late 2027, U.S. interest payments crossed $2 trillion per year, surpassing national defense spending for the first time in history. Treasury auctions weaken, foreign demand collapses, and the Federal Reserve is forced into unlimited bond purchases. The dollar begins to slip, not catastrophically, but steadily, structurally, predictably. A weakening dollar is unacceptable when the U.S. is trying to secure the world's most finite asset. So Washington accelerates the strategy. The Treasury formally discloses 700,000 plus Bitcoin under government custody and signals its intention to reach the 1 million mark for national financial security. Markets instantly understand what this means. The U.S. will buy at any price. Bitcoin surges. 2. The Chinese countermove. Beijing responds within days. The People's Bank of China publicly announces that the digital yuan is now partially backed by sovereign Bitcoin reserves. For the first time in history, a major global currency openly ties itself to Bitcoin. Simultaneously, the BRICS consortium unveils its long-rumored BRICS Bitcoin reserve, disclosing a combined pool exceeding 600,000 Bitcoin. This is the moment the world realizes the truth. Bitcoin is no longer a speculative asset. It is the contested backbone of the new financial system. 3. The inflection point. As the two superpowers solidify opposing systems, global trade fractures. Energy exporters settle 30% of contracts in Bitcoin-backed currencies. Asian manufacturing hubs adopt dual settlement rails. African and Middle Eastern nations diversify away from dollars. Western allies cling to the U.S. system but quietly acquire Bitcoin as insurance. The world is no longer dollar-centric. It is Bitcoin-anchored. 2027 becomes the year the monetary transition stops being avoidable. Bitcoin's role as a neutral reserve is no longer theoretical, it's structural, embedded, irreversible. By 2028, the world is no longer debating Bitcoin. The world is reorganizing around Bitcoin. Two competing monetary systems now operate side by side. The United States anchors its network with a 1 million Bitcoin strategic reserve, integrating BTC into treasury operations and global dollar liquidity. China counters with a Bitcoin-backed digital yuan and a BRICS reserve framework representing half the planet's population. The old system founded at Bretton Woods, sustained by the petrodollar enforced through sanctions, no longer has global reach. The new system, neutral, decentralized, mathematically limited, cannot be manipulated, censored, or monopolized. Bitcoin becomes the first asset in human history held simultaneously by rival superpowers who distrust each other, yet both depend on the same foundation for settlement and reserve stability. The consequences are profound. 1. A multipolar world. No single nation controls the monetary spine of the global economy. Every major power, US, China, India, Russia, Europe, anchors part of its reserves in Bitcoin. Geopolitical alliances still matter, but monetary coercion loses its dominance. Currency blocks form, but Bitcoin sits above them, all the neutral clearing layer that no army can seize and no government can inflate. 2. The end of the 20th century financial order. Treasuries, once the safest asset, are no longer the unquestioned global reserve. Central banks reduce dollar exposure not because they reject America, but because math forces diversification. Inflation can no longer be exported. Sanctions can no longer be imposed unilaterally. The privilege of printing the world's reserve currency dissolves. 3. The individual's advantage. For the first time in modern monetary history, individuals hold the same strategic asset as nation-states. A hardware wallet becomes a sovereign reserve. A private key becomes a form of geopolitical insulation. Those who recognize this early achieve generational advantage. Those who hesitated find themselves holding assets tied to weakening fiat regimes. 4. The final reality. The currency war ends not with victory, but with transformation. America fires the first shot. China escalates. BRICS organizes. And out of the conflict emerges a system neither side intended: a monetary order stabilized by a digital, permissionless, finite asset that no nation can dominate. Bitcoin becomes the settlement engine of a multipolar world. A new era begins.